Let me say a word about how we are going to record the recommendations we may hear from these 6 tables. The same way that we recorded the presentations and the responses. And we will make the presentations and responses available to the world at the Brite website. We will not make the conversations that we had after each presentation available. There may be folks who want to use this sequence of presentations and responses for their own discussion, so we won't suggest to them the kind of conversation they might have after having heard a presentation and response. We will be recording these recommendations, and then through the miracles of modern software, we'll get a pretty close written version, and then we'll listen to the tape and clean that up. And that's what we'll share with the General Board colleagues and others who might be interested. And we won't make that list public because we wouldn't want to appear to be taking the role that a General Board committee has been given. But we do want to assist that group as they continue that work. So I thought we might start at the back of the room and wonder who might speak for that table. They're such a modest, shy group.
I'm not sure we have any recommendations.
Well, you don't have to have any. Do you have any word that you want to share with us before the time that's been allocated to your table passes?
Chris, he wants you to...
Wait, I've got to give you a microphone when you speak.
Oh, gosh.
Okay, well, he can do this if anyone can, right? So you have the microphone.
Oh, my gosh.
Oh, my gosh.
I will try. I guess we could say, it's hard to say what recommendations are. It's a hard place to begin because we started out our conversation with, if we go through a process of trying to make significant adaptations to design, the processes that our denomination goes through is such a long, arduous process to make significant changes in terms of listening sessions and various things you do. The difficulty of that is not easy. Also felt like one of the other challenges is the multitude of financial resources of how to do things. You have regions and general units, and there's a multitude of budgets that entities are trying to fill their budgets, and how you would even allocate. We felt like the heart of the work is in local congregations, and it kind of mirrors some of the conversation of today, but even how to help congregations fund the mission when there's so many different kind of appeals to do that. And we're just having conversations about maybe some creative ways of how to get it, different kind of ways for congregations to invest in efforts that strengthen them as a congregation, but also strengthen them in connection to other congregations doing larger work. So is that a fair way of at least in the dialogue we had around the table?
I think we'll move to the table next door. Beth, are you at a table? What happened? Your table gone?
No, my table's over there. I'm
Since she's
notes.
taking notes, just let her speak for her table.
Well, I think you should make some sort of democratic decision about who will speak for your table. And she's taking notes, so who will speak for your table?
Tom got to go back.
Well, Tom, we're glad you come back from the bathroom because while you were gone, you were nominated to speak for your group, and better that you have been to the bathroom before speaking for your group. And here is your microphone.
And I wasn't even here for all the conversation. our conversation here at the table centered around ways to do more connecting. That's the centerpiece of who we are when we start trying to talk about the church beyond the local church. It still does revolve around the question of how can I help my congregation accomplish its mission in a better way, in a more clear way. How can I open my the folks that gather in our place? How can I open them up to all sorts of other people? And that is by that is by creating opportunities to be in connection with each other. And any manifestation of church beyond that needs to have that as its central goal. But there is still room and need for the church to be able to speak beyond the individual voices of individual Christians. And we've got to figure out a way to maintain that as well. I realize that's where we tend to get in trouble. But I think we need an opportunity to place in someone's hands the ability to speak for more than just themselves.
I'll come get that microphone. Well, I think that's fine. Pass it off. We'll go from this table, and that'll work.
Thank you. Three things that I think even they could tell me I missed something. One was not stated, but implicit debate about expanding expressions versus a focus on the local congregation. I think the consensus around this table was to lean toward the refocus on the local congregation, particularly equipping them for the sharing of the good news, the return to the Great Commission, and in the process identifying what at the local congregation they find most life-giving that we do better together, whether it's global missions or camps or other forms of collective ministry that we share in that sense. Second thing that sort of rose to the surface is the need to be light and nimble, and there was a lot of resonance with Charlie's comment that big changes in policy need fewer and fewer words. And then the third thing is really more my editorializing. I learned at Brite, you should always pay attention to what the speaker puts last, because it's usually their own opinion. And we do need to de-weaponize the word covenant and return it to voluntary. At the same time, we need to be clear and have a different category for those things which the denomination should and does impose in an involuntary manner. There are certain things that we simply have to insist that ministers don't do, usually more than they do. And if in the process of restructure we lose that, we leave our folks vulnerable. So, anything I miss? Is our time up?
Do you need more time?
I don't know.
Okay. I think you can pass this microphone to a distinguished pastor from Edmond, Oklahoma. We didn't give an award for who rode the farthest to get here.
I'm not sure that we didn't fly. We did drive a long
drove,
ways.
yeah, drove the most to get here. Yeah.
We tried to reflect the design, so we have covenanted together as a table to be different manifestations of the church. However, we couldn't trust each other enough to speak for the whole group, so we will remain silent.
Let's have a parking lot conversation.
Yeah, we're going to discuss it in the parking lot and then complain about the whole thing. Our conversation largely centered around accountability. and how each of the units can be held accountable, not only to local congregations, but to one another and to the general board, so that, you know, and we liked Rick's model with the Historical Society of how if you're going to spend over and above, you need permission from the general board, and so there's an accountability factor there. So the trust level between congregation and general units is quite present.
Is your table the only table that's heard Rick's recommendation? Or did you share?
I don't know if you shared with that.
About the cap on spending before you get permission from somebody else.
Yeah, we now have written into our bylaws that we can take, I can't remember exactly what the percentage is, but I mean, it works out to under 4.5% draw on our endowment. Usually it's, you know, 4 or in that neighborhood. But if we go above, if we need to go above that set amount, we have to get permission from the general board. So, I mean, you know, we're absolutely accountable to the whole church. We've turned over all of our books to Treasury Services. So Treasury Services does everything. It's completely transparent. We're part of the audit that is done with Treasury Services and OGMP every year. Let's see, what else? What else do we do that's so good? Oh, and all of our endowment is, well, this is not perfectly exactly true. There's a tiny bit, but the vast majority of our endowment is with Christian Church Foundation. And they report to us what we have to work with for the year, and we make our budget accordingly. We live within our means, and I think it's a good, accountable system, a responsible system, and I think it's going to serve us well into perpetuity, I think.
Who speaks for this middle table? Don, okay. Don, here is the microphone. So we have 2 responders at this table.
First, we asked the question, what would happen in your congregation if the elders said to the pastor, do what you need to do for the next year. We trust you and support you. Let's be in ministry together, but throw out all expectations previously. What would happen in your church? And then we talked about how do we do that at the regional and general church level. And we didn't come up with an answer to that, but I'm going to leave you to ponder that. Because we see the need for a fresh beginning, but how to. There's a lot to it. Thinking about the last 2/3, basically, of the design is what needs to be looked at. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could begin a conversation with all the voices at the table that have been marginalized in previous history, now at the table to create from scratch together. How beautiful that would be and how important that is for our healing and moving forward. But the how-to is difficult, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. We also talked about Reverend Bill Lee's recommendation, and so we move that we hire a full-time pastor to our African American churches, and this table will start the fundraising for that. Did you know that? Okay. We think it's a good idea, and one whose time has more than come.
Okay. Who does speak for this table? Is it Velva? Wonderful.
I thought I was going to have to fight with my friends, but no, I'll speak. So I want to begin with AI and not artificial intelligence, but appreciative inquiry. So the first question for me, or what is it that we appreciate? And that question was in my mind. It wasn't something that we raised at the table, but that's what I was listening for as in our conversation, is what are the things that we appreciate about who we are in the denomination and everything. And I came up with, I heard 3 things, and I want to invite my friends to add on to this. Theological reflection, of course, being in theological education, that's one of those things that I heard. Theological reflection, connection, and congregations. When it comes to theological reflection, the idea, and Bill Lee was the one who said this, about hiring an outside consultant to work with the denomination to ask the hard questions. I'm not going to unpack all these, I'll just name them. Connectionally, thought about General Assembly, and could it be something that's more than a stage-managed event of denial? This is from my dear friend, classmate from TCU, Chuck Blaisdell. And so then it led to the question of, what if we began with General Assembly and moved toward the design for affecting some change, some shift in how we live our life. And then from congregations, which we appreciate, that led to the appreciation of our pastors. And that if we have our pastors on board with things, at least particularly in some of our circles and our constituencies, if the pastor is on board, then the congregation generally is on board. And also focusing on the people in our congregations. How do we best, how can we do a better job of equipping them to not just know the gospel, but live it out? And that all of these things then affect, there's not a straight line. Everything affects everything else. Anything else?
Well, thank you much. In thinking about General Assemblies, General Assemblies grew out of a tradition that began as leaders of the church got together to figure out how best to do mission. And they have developed into what they are today, largely, spectator occasion. So the suggestion that there be more real consideration, discussion about how to do mission would be very much in the tradition that these gatherings stand. Yeah, yes, you may.
Thank you. There are 3 things specifically that were articulated about General Assembly. 1, make them every 4 years.
Amen.
2, have more preaching, and a festival of preaching that represents that speaks into the space who's a part of the denomination, and not necessarily feeling like we need to translate everything in order to make the masses comfortable, but live in the movement of the Spirit speaking to us as the Spirit speaks to us from our constituency. And so those were a couple of specific things that might be incorporated, that could be incorporated, that should be incorporated into General Assembly, that might help to move us into a different space of being together.
And do all of you know that the person just speaking, Velva Jordan, is the moderator-elect of the General Assembly? So she will be in a position to think about these matters 2 years out from now as another assembly is planned. Well, I think this has been a day of rich conversation. I want to express my own personal appreciation to every one of you in the room who have been part of the day and been engaged in listening and speaking and doing both well. and this final time of conversation. Before we go, I think it would be appropriate to once again express our appreciation to our three presenters and our three respondents. Go now in peace to serve Jesus Christ, whom we confess as Lord and Savior of the world. Amen.